And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. نعبر بداية عن تقديرنا.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I firstly express my thanks to the co-facilitators, the distinguished representatives of Finland and Jordan. And I would also like to thank the legal experts and secretariat staff. During many months of negotiations and many dialogues, both official and informal, you managed to bring people together where everybody was happy, was on an equal footing, and everybody was equally unhappy regarding the narratives of hate. No UN resolution can keep everybody happy or meet the needs of all. May I make just a few comments, which I hope will lead to development of the strategic approaches when we come to the next review in 2020. Firstly, the Syrian Arab Republic is a country which is really in the front line when it comes to the dangers of terrorism, given the sufferings borne by the Syrian people over past years with the rise of new methods of terrorism, cross-border terrorism. These are new sorts of terrorism, new models, which evolved rather despite the review of the strategy every 2 years. We all know about cross-border terrorism, about Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, Armies Without Borders, and Entertainers Without Borders. Although we're aware of the reasons which led to proposals on paragraphs about countries where foreign terrorist fighters return to their countries or to third countries, we reject the grounds put forward by certain states who deliberately rejected our proposals on the conditions which have led to the proliferation of this extremely dangerous phenomenon, as well as responsibility regarding the collusion of certain members of the international community and the failure of some to this situation unprecedented in history. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not repeating ourselves if we say that if the international community had shouldered its responsibilities from the very outset, and if the early warning system had been applied, and if the exchange of information on terrorism had occurred instead of eyes being shut, and if instead you had heard our pleas we have had flares of foreign terrorists more than from several countries towards Syria. Had you heeded our pleas, we would completely have eliminated this phenomenon, and we would not be here today discussing the danger of a return of these foreign terrorist fighters to their countries or to a third country or to a host country. But this has come about because of the collusion of some and the indifference of others. I would say that the crisis is not related to the legal document on combating terrorism, but rather to the sovereignty of states regarding counterterrorism. So the document has served as a tool for interference of a political and military order in the internal affairs of states. Regarding violent extremism, I would once again state our position on this. We believe that it's impossible to circumscribe the dimensions of extremism of a religious order and violent extremism which engenders terrorism. We have explained on several occasions that there are different examples of this. You're all aware that thousands of foreign terrorist fighters were classified by security services in their countries, categorized as extremely dangerous extremist elements, but not as violent. And they were under surveillance, continuous surveillance. Despite this, their non-violent extremism has become a reason for becoming a foreign terrorist fighter, and their government has enabled them to go to Syria or to Iraq, and some have returned to undertake terrorist operations, as has happened in Great Britain, France, the US, and other countries. Some governments have dubbed these as elements of the moderate Syrian opposition. There were governments which called these foreign terrorist fighters as members of a moderate opposition. Australia, Arabs, all these terrorists were called moderate members of an opposition. We heard them of them as jihadists when they shed blood in Syria. They were killed. They were called mujahideen, and when they returned to their countries, they became terrorists. I recall a statement from the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Fabius, who stated to Morocco in 2012, I quote,
En Syrie إن الجهاديين
French jihadists have done a good job in Syria. That is what Laurent Fabius said in 2012 to Morocco, in Morocco. The Prime Minister, who was Minister of the Interior before becoming a French Prime Minister, had already made a statement which was even more of a dangerous order. He said,
rien faire pour prévenir les djihadistes français d'aller en Syrie. يعني أنا لا أستطيع.
Nothing can be done to prevent French jihadists from going to Syria. So this was a Prime Minister and a Minister of Foreign Affairs who made these statements in 2012. But the terrorists that you sent to us in Syria, when they came back to France, they were called terrorists. Sir, our partners in the United Nations should, during the course of this review, have acknowledged that there are differences of view regarding the definition of violent extremism engendering terrorism, and that there are national considerations which govern the approaches that states adopt to combat extremism. And as I conclude, I would say that I regret the approach adopted by some which has involved cutting financing for capacity building on counterterrorism. And I would recall states rather that the Charter was based on principles of justice and mutual respect and not on immoral values. Which consider that the scope of aid funding imposes restrictions on others. So we regret the approach adopted by certain member states regarding the Syrian and Iranian proposal for reforms to the UN Counterterrorism Office in order to ensure transparency and participation. This is an office which belongs to member states, not to those who fund it. And we condemn the reasons for which certain countries have opposed our proposal regarding the reform of this center. And we've clearly shown the shortcomings to everybody of some members of the CETAD of this center. Syria will abstain, will always refuse to recognize the activity of this because it lacks transparency, integrity, and inclusivity. My country will oppose all proposals to fund this from the United Nations regular budget unless these serious problems regarding its working methods are resolved. So we clearly refuse the domination of one country in particular on the affairs of the center, over the affairs of the center, so that it has become a sort of a private enterprise operating from within the UN. Then my government, from the beginning of negotiations, expected certain states to object to any new proposal to combat hate discourse on internet and in social media. And we're sure that these same delegations will be against any international convention or UN agreement to monitor hate narratives on internet, recruiting, funding, and planning terrorist attacks. I referred to all of these points in the statement I made yesterday when I said that the United States delegation was opposed to a reference being made to incitement of terrorism on the internet on the pretext that this would be a violation of freedom of expression. In their view, freedom of expression prevents opposition to hate discourse on internet. Politics mean that some countries believe that freedom of expression and internet communication is a right that everybody should enjoy to allow peace and security. I don't think member states are naive. They are aware that the rejection of certain states of the UN's role regarding this hate discourse in Syria has to do with the egoistic economic interests wishing to dominate internet technology and the internet market and continuing to manipulate internet and the recruitment of combatants, as we see. And the pretext is, the alibi is that they are combating terrorism. So as I conclude, I would say that we believe that this strategy should be reviewed every 2 years because the mounting dangers of terrorism and new procedures demand a response of us which can rise above the selfish concerns of certain states, ending up as supporting terrorism. We're not talking about conclusions or hypotheses. We're taking as our basis information, confessions that we've obtained regarding foreign terrorist fighters. We're looking at facts in the UN, which have meant that some permanent members of the Security Council have refused to impose sanctions on certain bodies sanctions for Daesh and al-Qaeda because Syria asked for this. We have been requesting for more than a year that a terrorist body called the Movement for the Liberation of Syria be there. The UK and France have rejected our proposal because it was we who brought it forward. But recently, the United States added this organization to its list of terrorists. But when we want to see it there, when the proposal came for us, we were turned down. But when it's another state putting this forward, the request is accepted, and this organization has now been placed on the list of those considered terrorists. We believe that this strategy is important. It is necessary, despite the concerns that we have regarding certain paragraphs. And as well as the fact that some member states have wanted to introduce concepts which have nothing whatsoever to do to terrorism in order to scatter our collective efforts on counterterrorism. Meaning that we would be unable to implement the document. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic